Welcome to the Wildlife Control Training Group's channel. My name is Eric Arnold, and today we're going to talk about choosing a foothold trap for your coyote management. So let's go ahead and get started. So what I want to start with are the different parts of a foothold trap. So right here I have a foothold trap, and this thing sticking out, this is called the dog. This piece right here that goes up and down, this is what actually fires off the trap. This is known as the pan or the treadle. Then we have our levers here on the side. We have our jaws here in the center section. And then we have what's called the frame. This is the frame right here. Now, all your foot traps today, they are going to come with an amount of trap chain already connected to them. This one happens to be connected here on the edge. And it's put up onto what's called a swivel that allows the animal to spin in a circle so that it maintains basically being caught in your trap. There's a bunch of different styles of traps out there. There's a bunch of features that you need to be looking for, I feel, when you're looking at doing a coyote trap. The traps themselves range from semi-cheap all the way to very expensive. If you're going to be serious about your coyote management, you definitely want to take a look in that medium to high range just to make sure that your equipment's going to go ahead and last longer for you. So let's get into some of the differences now. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to cover some of the differences. I've got 3 traps out here in front of me. Each one of them is different. Now, some things that you need to understand from the start. There is no standard when it comes to trap sizes. So when you hear a manufacturer talk about this trap and they're calling it a number 2 trap, or they're calling it a 550 or something along those lines, there's no standard between the different manufacturers with the size of the traps. So before you buy any trap, you need to check your state regulations and find out what exactly you can have and use, because what you don't want to do is you don't want to go out and buy a dozen traps for $400 and then find out that you can't use them. So let's go over basically the standard trap. I've already shown you this before. This is what's called a Bridger number 3. Now again, keep in mind, it's called a number 3, but measurement wise, it has no correlation with like a Montgomery number 3 or a Duke number 3. We have, like I said before, our jaws, our trap chain. We have our trap connected here with the chain and with what's called a swivel. It is in the corner. I personally don't like this. To me, this is a trap that might be good for some animals, but for coyotes, they can beat this up without doing a lot of modification to it. So what I prefer is a slightly smaller trap. This is a Bridger number 2. Now notice it has the same things that the number 3 had. We've got our jaws, we've got our levers, we've got our dog, we've got the trap frame here. Both of them are Bridgers. This one is just a little bit smaller. This is actually what I consider to be the entry-level trap when you're talking about going for coyotes. So one of the first changes that I want you to take a look at is what's called a base plate. Now this one is welded on. You can actually have them drilled and you can have screws through them holding them in place. And then you put what's called a D-ring inside here, and then you connect your chain to that D-ring. What this does is this prevents the frame from bending. And coyotes are powerful enough to bend a trap frame. The biggest coyote I've caught to date is 47 pounds. My average is 39 pounds. I've only caught a couple that are 25 pounds. So coyotes, specifically eastern coyotes, they are rather on the large side, and they can go ahead and they can beat up a trap pretty good. So that's the first thing that you want to look for, is this base plate. Now, when you modify the base plate or you buy one that's already modified, you'll notice that the chain is no longer in the corner. The chain is dead center. And again, the reason for that is so that when the coyote's pulling on the trap, they don't bend the frame. It also doesn't allow them to slide their foot and actually get cut. It basically keeps the pressure all in the center of the trap. But you'll notice that we have a swivel with 2 rivets on here. This is one of the first modifications you want to make. Whether you want to keep the chain in the side or you want to go with the base plate, you need to add swivels. At an absolute minimum, you want 3 swivel points, I feel. The more swivels, the better. And you'll see when we get to the traps I prefer to use, how I have some of those set up, because there are some other things with that as well. But this is number 2 machine chain. More than strong enough to keep a coyote, not a problem whatsoever. It's about 10 inches of it or so. This rig right here, if I tied this on or connected it to my earth anchors, this would hold a coyote. I've caught many coyotes in this, not a problem. Personally, you'll hear things, or I should say personally, what I don't like. Let me go back to my jaws here. I don't like the jaws fitting together like this. I like what's called an offset jaw, and I'll show you that in my next example here with it. Another thing I want to point out to you are the springs. Now this is what is called a coil spring trap, and it's called a coil spring trap because, as you can see, we have 2 coil springs. You can have what's called 4 coil springs, and again, I'll show you this on the next trap. You'll have 2 here and 2 here. Now, the purpose of that is to speed up the trap. It is also to go ahead and help the trap break through in frozen ground, mud, that type of thing. Normally, I don't recommend 4 coil traps for coyotes. I just think that that's too much. Really, everything on the market, the 2 springs is more than enough, unless you are trapping in frozen ground. That's the one exception to the rule. And that's something that at that point you might want to take a look at, because what I do is I run mainly 2 coil spring traps until I have to work in frozen ground, at which point then I go over to the 4 coil spring traps. And again, I'll show you examples of this later on. Which brings us to the last example I've got. Now this is also a Bridger number 2, just like this one, but this one's been modified at the factory. This was what is called the K9 version of this trap. And first, what I want to point out is if you take a look right here, you'll see that we have a gap right here. Well, that gap is what's called an offset. And what this allows, it allows better blood flow to that trap foot so that the animal's much more comfortable. And that's something that I prefer. Also, you'll see that there's some stuff sitting on top here. See if I hold it up together there, if we can see the difference between the 2 or not. This is called lamination. What that's doing is that is giving more gripping surface to the jaws of the trap. And again, scientific tests have proven that this seems to be more comfortable for the animals. There's not the same amount of potential foot damage that can occur with the regular style trap. Now, if you were doing a lethal trap for raccoon or something like that, where it's a dispatch set, a trap like this is absolutely fine. But for coyotes, we're not making dispatch sets when we're using foothold traps, and that's why I prefer this gap in here. The other thing I want to show you in the last modification really is this is what I was talking about with the 4 coils. So we have our 2 coils right here, we have the 2 back here. This trap is harder to set because we have more tension on it, but this also is a much better trap to be putting in mud or specifically frozen conditions, because this will come up out of the ground and grab the animal's foot, where sometimes a double coil spring trap, it might struggle coming up to catch the animal. So that's a real fast breakdown on the modifications that you want to look for with the traps. Again, these are Bridger number 2s. This is the number 2. I consider this to be the entry-level trap for somebody. This is a little bit more expensive with the factory modifications. Personally, I like this trap. I've caught a lot of coyotes with it, but I do wish that it didn't have the 4 coils on it. I wish that they had this with just the 2 coils, and you might be able to get that these days. So now let's go ahead and take a look at the difference between square jaws and round jaws. Now, one of the big debates with choosing a foothold trap for coyote is whether you should be using what's called a square jaw trap or a round jaw trap. Quite honestly, it's 100% personal preference. Some people will say that square jaw traps have this benefit to it. Others will say, no, that's a liability. Round jawed traps have this benefit to it, and others will go, no, that's a liability. My personal belief is try them both if you can. I prefer the square jaw. That's just because of how I make my sets for it. I have a much higher capture rate with the square jaw, And again, it's because of how I construct my sets. So there is a little bit difference, I feel, if you're doing a round jaw or square jaw. So what I want everybody to see, if I hold them up here, hopefully you can see the difference in between. This is a Bridger number 2, square jaw. This is a Bridger number 1.65. And again, numbering doesn't matter. You know, there's no correlation there with it. But this is the round jaw. In addition, this one has rubber pads on it. Now, rubber pads were a phase that we had here in trapping. A lot of people felt that the rubber was actually going to be better for the animals. In my professional opinion, it's all based upon how you're using the equipment and the time of year. I know for a fact in freezing conditions, rubber is one of the worst materials that you can have holding an animal for you. You want to have metal. Again, you don't get the foot damage with the metal that you're going to get with the rubber jaws. On the flip side of that coin, if we're trapping like right now, this is July going into August, if we were putting out some traps right now, again doing our management program for coyotes, the rubber jaws would actually be fine. I would not have a problem with them at this time of year. We're not getting the freezing nights. We're not getting the clay mud that we work with here in Ohio for getting into all the grooves on the rubber and again affecting the animal. But I just wanted to point that out so that everybody understands there is a difference between the round jaw and the square jaw, and it's really all personal preference. Now, in terms of the 1.65, based upon your state and the size requirements or size limitations that you have, which every state's different. It's why I said earlier, you need to check your state laws. Every state measures different as well, so there's no way I can cover all this. The 1.65 will catch coyote. I have caught multiple coyotes in the smaller jaw trap here, the 1.65. But if I don't have to use it, I want to use something bigger, which is why, to me, still the Bridger number 2 is the best entry-level coyote management foot trap on the market. I've covered a bunch of stuff here. I know that I've gone real quickly through it, but what I want to do now is actually show you the traps that I prefer to use and talk a little bit about when I want to use them, why I've chosen what I've chosen, as well as just giving you basically a much better view of what else is available on the market. Okay, what I want to do now is actually talk about the traps I prefer to use and why I prefer to use the traps that I have here. I've got 4 traps on the table for you here. I really only use 3 out of the 4. Reason why I've got this one, this is what's called a Jake trap. This is a very, very well built trap, but it's also, I think, the most expensive trap that is here on the table. I want you to see that the levers here are made of wire instead of metal. Okay, that generally means that you have to have a special setting tool with it. Now, not everybody needs the setting tool. Sometimes you can stand on these with your feet and it's not a problem. But if you ever watch another video I have out there on trapping, you'll see that, you know, don't be scared to use setters. They make them for a reason. They make your life a lot easier with going through and setting these traps. The other thing that this trap has is what's called a shock spring. And I am a big, big fan of shock springs. What happens is that when a coyote is caught and pulls on it, it actually absorbs some of the stress on the chain and however you have this anchored to the ground, whether it's stakes, whether it's an earth anchor or whatever. What that does again is it eliminates a lot of stress on that animal's foot's in the trap here. We want to make that animal as comfortable as possible. And so I'm a big, big supporter of these. The Jake trap also has the rubber padded jaws. Again, this is something I'm not a super fan of, but you can take these off on at least some of the models that they have and go ahead and have the offset jaws with it. So now that I've covered this trap, let me go ahead and cover the ones I prefer to use. Okay, by far and away now, I've been trapping for over 20 years professionally. Personally, I've got much more than that into my trapping experience, my trapping knowledge base. I told you that the Bridger number 2 is what I consider to be the entry-level Coyote trap. What I prefer these days, hands down, is what is called the MB550. It's very reasonably priced. It definitely is more than the Bridger number 2 modified. And let me show you a couple special features that this has. First off, take a look, we've got our offset jaws here, but these jaws are made out of cast iron. So we don't have any welds to them like we have with the Bridger modified. Instead, what we have is one continuous piece, which again makes it nice and easy on that animal's foot. We also have a different pan system right here. This is called a Posse Trip Pan. And when we set this, we don't have to do a lot of modification with it to make sure that the pan is flush, and that gets into something outside the scope of this video. We'll cover that in another video. But basically, this in itself is worth the trap's weight in gold. As you can see, I have one of the shock springs attached to this. Again, this is something that I cannot promote enough. I'm not a fan of long chain, and you can see that this has quite a long chain with it. But because of the shock spring, I can get away with the long chain here. So one of the things that you do need to be careful of when you're working with cast iron jaws, before I forget to say this, is you really don't want to just fire off the trap and let the cast iron hit itself. They will break. So you don't want to go ahead and spend the money for these. Now again, these are very reasonably priced in my opinion. I think that it's $200 or so for a dozen of these. They're very easy to set. They have the regular lever, so no special tools required. They do have a base plate, and you can see on this one that the base plate has actually, instead of being welded on, has been bolted on. But this is my go-to Coyote trap these days. Absolutely love it. When I'm working in sandy conditions, the coil springs are a little bit difficult to work with, and that's when I prefer to go to what's called a double long spring foothold trap. Again, we have our offset jaws. This is a Victor N3. They don't produce these anymore, but you can definitely find something similar to them brand new, or there's a lot of these traps on the market. You can get on eBay, you can find places where they're for sale. You'll notice that the pan is a little bit different with this. With the dog, it doesn't have as much tension on it. But what I like about these in sandy soil is that these levers give me lots of stability. And that's why I prefer it over like the 550, because now I can put it in, make it so it's rock solid, it's not moving around. Coyote comes, steps into it, and we've got them. Last trap that I want to show you is I use strictly in frozen conditions, which unfortunately in Ohio means I can be using them anytime from basically November 15th, right after trapping season opened, all the way up to the end of the year, or I might not pull these out until January. This is the MB650. Now, I've not added the shock spring to this one. You'll see again, it does have the reinforced base plate, center swivel. It doesn't have a Posse Trip Pan on it. This actually has something different. And I don't know if you can see this on the video, but if you see these knobs right here, this actually, when it's set, holds both sets of the jaws down so they cannot move. Otherwise, you have something called a loose jaw. Now, some people have a problem with the loose jaw. I personally don't, but we have our wire springs here. I definitely recommend using the setters, buying the setters for this. This is an excellent coyote trap. A lot of the real good coyote trappers use this trap. They'll use it in conditions that I won't. They'll use it as a primary trap, and that's absolutely fine. But this is one of the best ones. This is probably the second most expensive trap, though, that I've put up here. So for most people looking at getting into trapping, most people who are doing some limited trapping for management of their coyotes for their deer herd, this is a bit of an overkill. I would definitely recommend going with the MB550 instead. So real quick, let me go ahead and set this so I can show you that loose jaw I was talking about. Okay, and this is what I like about the Posse Trip, is that I can put that up there stick my thumb underneath so I can't get caught. Gently come down. I don't know if you heard that click or not. That tells me that this trap is now set. You can see that the pan's nice and level. You can also see I can do this. This is what I'm referring to as a loose jaw, okay? Some people like it. I personally have no problem with it. Other people don't. They feel that the coyote steps on this. They feel that, like if it's digging or something like this, it can throw up this arm, and then the coyote can uncover the trap. Instead of stepping in and get caught, you have an exposed trap. That's not my belief system. Matter of fact, in my experience, those are called digging animals, and it's almost always a raccoon that's causing you a problem. It's not a coyote, it's not a fox. But this is my preferred trap, hands down. Nice and easy. You saw how easy it was for me to set, no special tools needed. In freezing weather, I like the MB650 because it is double coiled. It's got the 4 coils with it. You can see how big the coils are versus what was on the Bridger 4 coil. And then in soft sandy soils, I prefer the double long spring. So that's what we've got for you. Hopefully that all made sense. Coyote trapping with a foothold trap, it does take a certain skill level. So be prepared to get out there, work with it. We will be doing other videos showing actual bedding of the traps, making sets, that type of thing. But I wanted to start off with, if you're gonna go out and buy traps to start with, there's just not a lot of information out there currently as to what to be looking for. So again, you wanna be looking for nice thick jaws, and that's prefer the cast jaws. You wanna be looking for this reinforced base plate, okay? And you wanna be looking at something like this Posse Trip system just because it's so much easier to work with. So that's gonna be it. Thank you very much. Subscribe to our channel to get more information like this on dealing with your wildlife control problems.